Andy McCarthy is here with us. Hi, Andrew. How are you, sir?
Glenn, I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. I mean, if you listen to the press, it's a somber and sad and sobering day. And it is all of those things. I just don't believe they believe that. Can you give us some idea of what today is going to look like?
Well, it's going to look like the beginning of a process that I think is being misdescribed in the press because we're kind of a step behind. What they're explaining to you, and the reason this is supposed to be a sad and somber day in the theater before us, is that this is the beginning of the criminal justice process where someone is brought in and arraigned on a set of formal allegations known as an indictment, and that begins the formal process of a criminal case. But I think, Glenn, just as Alvin Bragg would be better understood by the public as an elected progressive Democrat than as a law enforcement official, you know, back probably a decade ago, it was still the case, even in Manhattan, that if you were to campaign as someone whose agenda was to put the law enforcement power of the office in the service of a partisan agenda to go after one particular nemesis of the party, that would have been disqualifying. Now it's what's expected in Manhattan. And this process is not really, in the end, it's not about whether they can take a trifling case, and it really is trifling. It's a case Bragg would never bring against anyone else. But it's not whether they can bring a trifling set of allegations and prove them, and Donald Trump is found guilty or not guilty. This is about making the process the penalty. This is about making this as financially prohibitive, emotionally wrenching, and personally humiliating as they can for Trump. And it's kind of the criminal justice system version of the Kavanaugh confirmation hearing. It's to create an interorum effect, which conveys to conservatives and Trump supporters and anyone else who opposes this Bolshevik left that this is what we've got for you if you dare to oppose us. And that's what this is really about. It's not so much a criminal justice process, which is, you know, we can go through the nuts and bolts of that, but we should acknowledge, I think, what's really happening here.
So can you, because now, I mean, you can indict a ham sandwich is the old saying, but it's got to go to a jury and got to go through a trial now. Do you think you can get a fair trial in Manhattan for Donald Trump?
I think if the court were fair, the answer to that would be yes. I mean, I tried terrorists in the 1990s in that same little half square mile area of Manhattan, only 8 blocks away from where they had bombed the World Trade Center. And, you know, terrorists were very unpopular, obviously, with New York juries. But no one who looked at that case didn't think that we got a fair jury for it. But if the process is rigged, that, you know, we got a fair jury because the process wasn't rigged. We had a fair judge. We had a, you know, due process of law. The question is the court going to be as rigged against Trump as the DA is? If that's the case, then, you know, it's already over.
How is this possible? How did this? I mean, it's stunning, I think, to most Americans to see what's happening in Washington, D.C. with our court system, what's happening in New York with our court system. It's one thing for the DA. It's another to have the court system so far gone on politics.
Well, it's really a reflection, Glenn, of what's happened in the culture. And the reason I can say that with confidence is in the federal system, judges and district attorneys who are U.S. attorneys in the federal system, they're not elected officials. They're appointed by the president. In theory, the credentials for those kinds of positions are that you will uphold the rule of law without fear or favor. You won't use your power as a partisan weapon. And we have them vetted by the Senate, at least in theory, to make sure that they're the kind of people who won't do that. That's not what we have in the state system. These positions are elected positions, and at a certain point, the well springs of funding on the progressive left. George Soros' name is mentioned all the time, but he's hardly the only figure who's of importance here. But they realize that, in these one-party blue cities, DA's positions, there virtually was not a campaign at all for them. They were decided by the party bosses, like who would fill the slot. They're not competitive races. They were five-figure campaigns at best, and probably in the low five figures. So these guys realized they could come in with, 6-7 figures of funding, blow away the competition, install their own progressive prosecutors into these slots. And that's real power. It's one thing to take over the courts or to take over a legislature. They're kind of slow-moving institutions. But if you're a prosecutor, you have real instant power. You can decide who gets charged, who doesn't get charged. Doesn't matter how aggressive the police are. It's up to the prosecutor what happens to these cases. So if you get a progressive ideologue in that kind of a position with no effective political check on him, that's real power, and that's what's happened in these municipalities.
So tell me about what you know about the case. We have heard that this is about Stormy Daniels, but that is something that the FEC passed on, the federal system passed on, the statute of limitations is over, and it's a misdemeanor, and he has made it into a felony charge, and there are 34 felonies. That's what we've heard. What do you think you know?
Well, I think he's taking two transactions, which are these hush money arrangements with two women who claim to have had affairs with Trump in around 2006, and who were paid off in different ways in the waning weeks of the 2016 election when their extortionate leverage was highest to try to get paid off to remain silent about their past interaction with Trump. So this is all 7 years old. That's when these non-disclosure arrangements were done. And I think the way they're getting 34 counts out of it, Glenn, is the kind of abuse of prosecutorial authority that they warn against in the Justice Department manual, where they tell you not to stack up counts where it's not necessary. A lot of times, rogue prosecutors will try to camouflage with quantity the lack of quality of the evidence of their case. And it's easy to do this. If you and I were in a stolen, let's say we're in a stolen property conspiracy where we're going to try to transfer and steal stolen property, I hand it to you to say, Glenn, what do you think this is worth? And you hand it back to me after you've appraised it. And I said, well, take another look. And, by the time we've passed it back and forth 8 times, each one of the times we hand it from one to the other is a separate felony. Now, no one sensible ever charges it that way. There's just two of us and one set of stolen property. But you can see the mischief that can be made by if you get hyper technical about what a distribution means. So what I think happened here is, especially with Stormy Daniels, this is the easiest one to explain. Michael Cohen lays out the money, and then they decide they're going to pay Cohen by making it look like he's getting paid legal fees rather than being reimbursed for a loan. So they decide to pay him over 12 installments. They have him submit an invoice, and then Trump or someone in the Trump organization pays him a check. So what I imagine is with each individual payment, there's an invoice, there's a check, and there's some entry on the records. So just, based on what the example I just gave you can easily see where we could come up with 36 charges, right? Just from that, even though it's all one scheme. So that's the kind of game they're playing here. And the idea, Glenn, is there's not much evidence here, but it's a subtle way of trying to convey to the jury that this guy must be a terrible guy, because otherwise, why would the state have lodged 34 counts against him?
Correct.
Oh, my God, he must be Nicky Barnes.
So when you look at these charges, first of all, is it illegal for Donald Trump to pay either of these women off?
No. Non-disclosure agreements are a staple of civil litigation in the United States. They happen all the time.
And that's not even immoral. I mean, what they were charging may have been immoral, but for him to pay them off, it's not immoral and it's not illegal. It's
Correct.
A business transaction. That happens all the time.
Right. So what's going on is Bragg, in his mind, as a progressive Democrat, he has decided that it can't possibly be that the Democrats ran an atrocious candidate against Trump. It must be that he stole the 2016 election. And the way he did it was by having these dark hush money arrangements, which he didn't disclose before Election Day. And that's why Mrs. Clinton was defeated. So this has to be pursued as if it were a violation of the campaign finance laws. And mind you, Glenn, if it actually was a campaign finance expenditure, which I don't think it was as a matter of law, Trump wouldn't have had to disclose it, even if he considered it one, until long after the 2016 election. So this whole thing is like left-wing fantasy land, but that's what we're...
So wait a minute. So, but they're trying to get him because they claimed it was legal, which seems more reasonable to me, that it was illegal. You are taking and you are paying somebody, and you're having your attorney have them sign a paper. So it's an illegal. It's a legal expense. In my book, it would be much more than campaign. If he would have made a campaign expenditure, then he's using campaign money for personal stuff. I mean, that would have been worse, wouldn't it?
Yeah, they would have gotten him on that. This is not one of these things where there's a way out. There's not. I mean, they get him coming and go. And if he didn't disclose it, it's because he was intentionally violating the campaign finance laws. And if he had disclosed it as a campaign expense, they would have said how outrageous it was that he would use campaign funds for something like this. So, yes, it's Kafka. You know, I mean, they just get him whichever way he goes.
Giving the other side the benefit of the doubt, giving the prosecution, and I don't know if you can, but try, giving them a benefit of the doubt. Is there any way you could make this case make sense without politics?
No. Well, no, but, you know, to broaden the lens, Bragg's agenda with respect to everyone who's not named Donald Trump is to not prosecute.
Correct.
So what we have in New York is we have very serious crimes, which are felonies, which he either pleads down to misdemeanors or, just as commonly, doesn't prosecute at all. So the thought that anybody in New York would be prosecuted for misdemeanor falsification of records is very hard to take, because we have people committing serious crimes here who don't get prosecuted. So it's really hard to take the politics out of this, Glenn. Plus, you know, just to go back to the beginning, he's an elected official. He's not an appointed law enforcement official. He got elected promising to leverage his power against Trump.
Now, isn't the exact same thing that Donald Trump is accused of doing, isn't it the same thing that Hillary Clinton was accused and convicted of doing, or her campaign?
Well, what he's formally going to be accused of is falsifying Trump Organization business records. And the way they get that into a felony is, in New York, the misdemeanor can become a felony if the person was trying to cover up another crime by falsifying the records. So I don't even think they're going to be able to prove, if it's a fair proceeding, that there's a falsification of records, because for that you have to show that the person acted with an intent to defraud, and I don't see any intent to defraud here. There's nobody who was conceivably harmed by the way that they booked this thing. Well, but it's even more preposterous to say that he concealed another crime, because the crime I think they want to point to is campaign finance violations, the failure to disclose this as a campaign in-kind donation. And not only was it not one, but, you know, more to the point, when the New York statute talks about concealing another crime, what they're obviously talking about is a New York penal crime, not a federal campaign finance crime. So I don't think that Bragg even has jurisdiction to to enforce
This
the
is
federal
craziness.
campaign finance laws if there was a violation here, which I don't think there was.
But didn't Hillary Clinton, wasn't she charged because of the Steele dossier? She marked it down as a legal expense. Isn't that pretty much the same thing?
Yes. In other words, misrepresenting what was an in-kind campaign contribution as legal
Right.
fees. That's exactly right. Yes.
Correct. And so she paid a fine, and it's a misdemeanor.
Glenn, that's the other thing here. Nobody gets prosecuted for these campaign finance violations. The Obama campaign in 2008 had like a record. I don't remember. It was like $2.5 million violation. They paid a $300,000 fine. The last person prominently who was prosecuted for one of these things, John Edwards, the case was a disaster. And this is actually an amusing bit because, for Bragg to win, he has to show that Trump not only knew that he had committed a campaign finance violation, but that he acted with that in mind in falsifying the records. I don't know how he could have known this was a campaign finance violation, putting aside that it wasn't. When in the Edwards case, there's two federal bureaucracies that regulate this, the Justice Department and the Federal Election Commission. They disagreed on whether it was a campaign violation. The FEC said no. The Justice Department prosecuted it. And then the judge looked at it and said, well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. He let it go to the jury, and the jury said no. So who knows what a campaign finance
Unbelievable.
violation